The morning mist clung to Lake Geneva as delegates from 43 nations filed into the imposing Palace of Justice. Ancient oak panels lined the walls, their dark with bearing witness to decades of international disputes. The marble floors echoed with the measured steps of diplomats, their whispered conversations creating a symphony of tension. Outside, Swiss guards stood motionless there, ceremonial, uniforms a stark contrast to the storm brewing within. The ornate ceiling, adorned with symbols of justice from every continent, seemed to watch over proceedings. This was no ordinary session. The air itself crackled with anticipation. Ibrahim Traoré sat in the defendant's section, his simple military fatigues, a deliberate contrast to the expensive suits surrounding him. His weathered hands rested calmly on the mahogany table, betraying none of the gravity of the accusations leveled against his government. The young president of Burkina Faso had traveled 8,000 kilometers to face charges that could reshape Africa's future. Behind him, a small delegation of advisors shifted nervously there, eyes darting between the judges and their leader. The gallery buzzed with international journalists, their cameras trained on the man who had dared to challenge Western influence. Every breath in the room seemed calculated, every glance loaded with meaning. Judge Thomas Harrison III adjusted his robes with theatrical precision, his silver hair catching the light streaming through stained glass windows. The American jurist had built his career on high-profile cases, each victory adding another layer to his reputation. His piercing blue eyes surveyed the courtroom with the confidence of a man who had never lost an argument. The gavel in his hand felt familiar. A conductor's baton, ready to orchestrate another legal symphony. Around him, fellow judges from Britain, France, and Germany nodded approvingly. Their alliance unspoken but understood. The Western legal establishment had gathered its finest minds for this moment. The morning session was set to address allegations of human rights violations and economic disruption across the Sahel region. Traoré's recent expulsion of French troops had sent shockwaves through European capitals, threatening decades of carefully constructed influence. The charges, though diplomatically worded, carried the weight of centuries of colonial resentment. As the clock struck 9, Harrison raised his gavel, the sound cutting through the tension like a blade. The fate of African sovereignty hung in the balance, and every person in that room understood the stakes. History was about to witness either justice or judgment. Judge Harrison's voice boomed across the courtroom with the authority of centuries of Western jurisprudence. Behind him, his opening words carried the weight of institutional power, each syllable carefully crafted to establish dominance. We gather today to address the concerning actions of a regime that has forgotten its place in the international order. The microphone amplified his every breath, creating an intimate yet intimidating atmosphere. European delegates nodded in synchronized approval, their silent endorsement filling the room with palpable tension. Traoré remained motionless, his dark eyes fixed on the judge with unwavering focus. The accusations flowed like a rehearsed performance, each charge building upon the last with calculated precision. Harrison spoke of destabilizing partnerships and threatening regional security with conviction of a man delivering gospel truth. His gestures were theatrical, hands sweeping across the air as if painting the narrative in real time. The translator's voice echoed in multiple languages, ensuring every delegate understood the gravity of his words. Behind him, the scales of justice seemed to tilt with each pronouncement, their balance disturbed by the weight of accusation. The gallery of journalists scribbled frantically, capturing every inflammatory phrase for tomorrow's headlines. This court has witnessed many cases of misguided leadership, Harrison continued, his tone growing more condescending with each sentence. His eyes swept the room before settling on Traoré with barely concealed disdain. The judge's American accent carried hints of Southern privilege, each word dripping with the arrogance of assumed superiority. Fellow judges leaned forward slightly, their interest piqued by the increasingly personal nature of the address. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed to dim as Harrison's shadow fell across the courtroom. Even the court stenographer paused momentarily, sensing the shift in atmosphere from legal proceeding to personal confrontation. The final portion of his opening statement crackled with barely contained hostility. Years of Western frustration. With African independence movements bubbling to the surface, Harrison's voice rose with righteous indignation as he outlined the chaos Traore had allegedly unleashed across the region. His words painted a picture of a reckless leader who had forgotten his debt to the international community. The European delegates shifted in their seats, anticipating the climax of this carefully orchestrated performance. In the defendant section, Traore's advisors exchanged worried glances, sensing their leader was being led into a trap. The stage was perfectly set for the insult that would define this historic confrontation. The tension reached its breaking point as Judge Harrison's patience visibly cracked during Traore's measured response to the charges. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the gavel, the veneer of judicial composure beginning to slip. Your Honor would respect these accusations. Ignore the legitimate aspirations of Burkina Faso people, Traore had said calmly. Harrison's face flushed red. Decades of unchallenged authority suddenly confronted by quiet defiance. The courtroom held its collective breath as the judge's mask of professionalism finally shattered. What happened next would echo through diplomatic corridors for generations. Enough. Harrison's voice exploded across the chamber, causing several delegates to flinch visibly. His gavel crashed down 3 times in rapid succession, each strike reverberating like thunder through the marble hall. The elderly judge rose from his seat, his robes billowing dramatically as he pointed an accusatory finger. You come here, speaking of sovereignty, while your people starve in the streets. His American accent thickened with rage, the southern drawl becoming more pronounced with each word. The court's stenographers' fingers flew across the keys, documenting every inflammatory syllable of this unprecedented outburst. The words that followed would be replayed on every news channel within hours, crystallizing centuries of colonial arrogance into one devastating phrase. If you cannot respect the institutions that have maintained global order, then go back to Burkina Faso. Harrison's voice cracked with the intensity of his fury, spittle flying from his lips. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the mechanical horror of cameras capturing this historic moment. European delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing their colleague had crossed an unforgivable line. Even the Swiss guards at the entrance turned their heads, drawn by the unprecedented breach of diplomatic protocol. The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning the atmosphere of what was supposed to be a temple of international justice. Harrison seemed to realize immediately that he had destroyed his own credibility, but the words could not be taken back. Journalists in the gallery began furiously typing, understanding that they were witnessing a career-ending moment disguised as righteous indignation. The judge's fellow jurists stared at him in horror, their own reputations now tainted by association. In that moment, the mask had slipped completely, revealing the ugly face of institutional racism that had lurked beneath centuries of legal formality. The stage was set for a response that would redefine African dignity on the world stage. The silence that followed Harrison's outburst was unlike anything the Palace of Justice had ever witnessed in its decades of operation. It was the kind of profound quiet that follows a catastrophic earthquake when the world itself seems to pause in disbelief. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop, humming, as if the building itself had inhaled sharply and forgotten to exhale. The tick of the ornate wall clock became thunderous in the vacuum of sound, each second marking the death of diplomatic decorum. Court reporters sat frozen, their fingers hovering over keyboards as they processed what they had just documented. The weight of history pressed down upon every person in that chamber like a suffocating blanket. European delegates sat paralyzed in their leather chairs, their faces pale with the realization of what their colleague had unleashed. French Ambassador Du Bois loosened his silk tie unconsciously, beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the morning chill. The German representative's mono slipped from his eye, clattering onto his notepad with a sound that seemed to echo forever. British barrister Peton covered her mouth with trembling fingers, her decades of diplomatic training unable to prepare her for this moment. Their carefully constructed facade of civilized jurisprudence had crumbled in an instant, revealing the raw prejudice beneath. The institutional racism they had worked so hard to disguise now stood naked before the world. In the media gallery, seasoned journalists who had covered wars and revolutions sat stunned by the magnitude of what they had witnessed. CNN's veteran correspondent Sarah Mitchell fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking as she tried to process the career-defining story unfolding before her. The BBC's African affairs expert dropped his pen, the small sound amplifying the oppressive silence like a gunshot. A laser's camera operator continued filming despite his shock, instinctively understanding that this moment would be studied for generations. Reuters' photographer clicked rapidly, her lens capturing faces frozen in disbelief across the chamber. They knew they were documenting the moment when centuries of diplomatic pretense finally collapsed under its own weight. The Swiss court officials exchanged horrified glances, their neutral nation's reputation now stained by hosting this unprecedented breach of international protocol. The lead clerk's face had drained of all color as he realized the paperwork nightmare that would follow this diplomatic catastrophe. Security guards near the entrance shifted nervously, uncertain whether they were witnessing history or witnessing a crime. The court interpreter removed her headphones, slowly, unable to believe she had just translated words that would ignite a continent. Even the cleaning staff, who had paused their work in the corridors, could sense the seismic shift occurring within those hallowed walls. The world had changed in an instant, and every soul present understood that there would be no returning to the way things were. In the deafening silence that followed Harrison's racist outburst, Ibrahim Traoré remained seated for what felt like an eternity, his weathered hands, scarred from years of military service and nation building, rested calmly on the mahogany table before him. The young president's breathing was measured and deliberate, each inhalation a moment of preparation for what was to come. His dark eyes never left Judge Harrison's face, studying the man who had just revealed the ugly truth behind Western jurisprudence. The weight of his ancestors seemed to settle upon his shoulders, generations of African dignity calling out for vindication. When he finally began to rise, it was with the slow, purposeful movement of a lion preparing to defend his pride. The sound of his chair sliding back on the marble floor cut through the silence like a blade through silk. Traore's military bearing was unmistakable as he straightened to his full height, his simple fatigues a stark contrast to the ornate robe surrounding him. His movements were fluid yet deliberate, each gesture carrying the accumulated wisdom of his 34 years on Earth. The fluorescent lights above seemed to focus on him like a spotlight, illuminating the quiet strength etched into every line of his face. Behind him, his small delegation held their breath, sensing that their leader was about to make history. The entire courtroom leaned forward unconsciously, drawn by the magnetic presence of a man who had nothing left to lose. Traore's hands moved to straighten his uniform jacket, the simple gesture somehow more dignified than all the ceremonial pomps surrounding him. His eyes swept the room slowly, taking the faces of those who had come to judge him and his nation. There was no anger in his expression, no hatred despite the venom that had just been spat at him and his people. Instead, there was something far more powerful, the unshakable certainty of a man who knew his place in history. The silence stretched on, building pressure like steam in a kettle as delegates realized they were witnessing the calm before an unprecedented storm. Even the cameras seemed to focus more intently, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. When Traore finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the vast chamber with crystal clarity. "Your Honor," he began, the words dripping with irony as he addressed a man who had just dishonored himself and his institution. His accent carried the musical cadence of his homeland, each syllable infused with the rhythm of African drums and the wisdom of ancient Go. The microphone amplified not just his words, but the quiet dignity that radiated from every fiber of his being. In that moment, every person in the courtroom understood that they were about to witness something that would be remembered long after all of them were gone. The storm was about to break, and its thunder would echo across continents. Your Honor, Traore's voice carried across the chamber with the quiet strength of flowing water cutting through stone. His words were measured, each one chosen with the precision of a master craftsman selecting the perfect tool. You have just demonstrated exactly why Africa must chart its own course in this world. The translator's voice echoed in multiple languages, but somehow Traore's original word seemed to carry more weight than any translation could capture. His gaze never wavered from Harrison's face, holding the judge accountable with nothing more than unwavering eye contact. The courtroom remained frozen, every delegate hanging on each carefully chosen syllable. For centuries, men like you have sat in rooms like this, deciding the fate of people you have never met. In lands you have never walked, Traore's tone remained respectful yet firm, his military training evident in his perfect posture and controlled delivery. Each word was a surgical strike against the foundation of Western arrogance that had just been exposed. The European delegates shifted uncomfortably as his analysis cut through their diplomatic pretenses like a heated knife through butter. His voice grew stronger with each sentence, drawing power from the righteousness of his cause. The morning light streaming through the window seemed to illuminate him as he spoke, casting shadows that danced across his determined features. You tell me to go back to Burkina Faso as if it were a punishment, as if my homeland were something to be ashamed of. Udi, a slight smile played at the corners of Traore's mouth. The first emotion he had shown since the insult was hurled at him. His voice carried a note of pride that resonated through every word, transforming Harrison's intended slur into a badge of honor. The gallery of journalists leaned forward, sensing they were witnessing the transformation of shame into strength in real time. Behind him, his advisors' worried expressions began to shift towards something approaching admiration. The young president was not just defending himself. He was defending an entire continent's right to dignity. But you have revealed something profound in your anger, something that your institutions have worked for decades to hide. Traore paused, allowing the weight of his observation to settle over the chamber-like morning mist over Lake Geneva. His eyes swept the room, meeting the gaze of every European delegate who dared to look at him. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility, as if the very air was waiting to see what revelation would come next. Even Harrison seemed hypnotized by the quiet authority emanating from a man he had tried to humiliate. In just 5 minutes, the power dynamic in the room had completely shifted, and everyone present could feel it. You want to know what Burkina Faso means, Your Honor? Traore's voice rose slightly, carrying the rhythm of ancient storytellers who had passed down wisdom through generations. His hands gestured gracefully as he spoke, painting pictures in the air that seemed to bring his homeland to life before the assembled delegates. It means land of upright men, men and women who refused to bow their heads in shame for crimes they did not commit. The translation echoed through multiple headsets, but somehow the original Moor phrase seemed to resonate even among those who didn't understand the language. European delegates found themselves leaning forward despite their discomfort, drawn into a narrative that was rewriting their understanding of the continent. They thought they knew. The young president's voice carried the authority of ancestors stretching back millennia. While your nations were building their wealth on the backs of enslaved Africans, the kingdoms of West Africa were centers of learning and commerce. Traore's words cut through centuries of historical revisionism like a sword through silk. Each factor carefully aimed blow against Western superiority narratives. His voice gained momentum, drawing power from a truth that had been suppressed for generations by those who profited from ignorance. The University of Timbuktu was educating scholars while Europe languished in what you call the Dark Ages. He continued, his eyes boring into Harrison's increasingly uncomfortable face. French. Delegates shifted in their seats, their colonial guilt manifesting as visible discomfort despite their diplomatic training. The camera lenses focused tighter, capturing every nuance of this impromptu history lesson that was dismantling decades of carefully constructed propaganda. Your anger reveals a fear that has driven Western policy toward Africa for centuries. The fear that we might remember who we were before you told us who we should be. Each word landed with the precision of a master archer, finding its target in the collective conscience of every European present. Traore's military bearing had transformed into something more profound, the bearing of a teacher, explaining uncomfortable truths to reluctant students. His voice carried across the chamber like thunder rolling across the savannah, impossible to ignore and impossible to silence. The Swiss officials exchanged glances, realizing they were witnessing a seismic shift in international discourse happening in real time. Even the building itself seemed to vibrate with the power of words that were reshaping the very foundations of diplomatic protocol. So when you tell me to go back to Burkina Faso, you reveal your deepest terror that Africa might finally go back to being Africa. The profound simplicity of this statement hit the chamber like lightning, illuminating truths that had been hidden in shadows for generations. Traore paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over delegates who were slowly realizing their worldview was crumbling in real time. His smile widened slightly, not with malice, but with the satisfaction of a teacher watching understanding dawn in his students' eyes. The 10-minute mark was approaching, but time itself seemed to have stopped in deference to the magnitude of what was unfolding. History was being rewritten one sentence at a time, and every person present understood they were witnessing something that would echo through generations. But I did not come here to relitigate the past, Your Honor. I came to speak of the future that terrifies you even more. Traore's voice shifted from historical professor to visionary leader, his tone carrying the weight of prophecy and the certainty of inevitable change. His eyes blazed with the fire of a man who had seen beyond the horizon of current possibilities into a reality that others could barely imagine. The courtroom fell deeper into silence as delegates realized they were witnessing not just a defense, but a declaration of independence for an entire continent. His words painted pictures of African unity that made Western hearts race with anxiety and African hearts swell with hope. The translation booths worked frantically to capture not just his words, but the revolutionary spirit behind them. Today, as we speak, young Africans are building solar panels in Ghana, writing code in Rwanda, and launching satellites from Nigeria. Each achievement he listed was a nail in the coffin of Western assumptions about African capability and potential. His voice grew stronger with every example, drawing power from the undeniable reality of a continent, awakening to its own possibilities. European delegates found themselves unconsciously taking notes, suddenly aware of developments they had deliberately ignored for decades. The media gallery erupted in whispered conversations as journalists realized they were witnessing the articulation of a new world order. His vision was not just inspiring, it was inevitably unstoppably real. We are building trade routes that bypass your ports, currencies that ignore your banks, and partnerships that respect our sovereignty. Traore's final statements landed like hammer blows on the anvil of Western hegemony, each word forging a new reality in real time. His military training showed in his precise delivery, each sentence a strategic strike at the foundations of economic colonialism. The Swiss clock on the wall seemed to tick, louder as his 15 minutes approached, marking the countdown to a new era in international relations. Judge Harrison sat frozen in his chair, realizing he had awakened a sleeping giant with his racist outburst. The courtroom felt smaller somehow, as if Traore's vision had expanded beyond its marble walls to encompass the entire world. So yes, Your Honor, I will gladly go back to Burkina Faso, and I will take Africa's future with me. His final words rang out like a bell, clear and true, and impossible to ignore or forget. The young president stepped back from the podium with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout his address, his mission accomplished without raising his voice or losing his composure. The silence that followed was different from before, not shocked or uncomfortable, but pregnant with possibility and change. Even his harshest critics knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary, a speech that would be studied and quoted for generations. As he returned to his seat, Ibrahim Traoré had transformed from defendant to prophet, from accused to inspiration, from isolated leader to voice of a continent finally ready to speak for itself. Within minutes of Traoré's final words, the courtroom erupted into controlled chaos as journalists scrambled to file the story of the century. CNN's Sarah Mitchell was already live on air, her voice trembling with excitement as she described the unprecedented diplomatic earthquake she had just witnessed. The BBC's African correspondent frantically typed on his laptop, his fingers flying across keys, as he tried to capture the magnitude of what had just unfolded. Al Jazeera's cameras had captured every gesture, every inflection, every moment of Traoré's transformation from defendant to continental voice. Reuters photographers clicked rapidly, their lenses documenting the shell-shocked faces of European delegates still processing what they had heard. The Swiss press corps worked with mechanical precision, understanding they were documenting a moment that would define international relations for decades. Social media exploded across the globe as clips of Harrison's racist outburst and Traoré's dignified response spread like wildfire through digital networks. Twitter hashtags and Rory response an hour. Go back to Burkina Faso began trending worldwide within 30 minutes with millions of users sharing fragments of the historic speech. Facebook posts from African diaspora communities flooded timelines with pride and vindication, their long-suppressed voices finally finding an echo in international halls of power. Instagram stories captured watch parties in universities from Laos to London, young people cheering as they witnessed their continent's dignity being restored on the world stage. TikTok creators began crafting viral videos celebrating Traoré's most powerful quotes, transforming diplomatic history into accessible content for a generation. Hungry for authentic African leadership, the digital revolution had found its voice in a Burkina president's 15-minute response to centuries of condescension. Television networks across Africa interrupted regular programming to broadcast Traoré's speech in its entirety, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing a watershed moment in continental history. Ghana Broadcasting Corporation's anchor wiped away tears as she introduced the footage, her voice thick with emotion at seeing African dignity defended so eloquently. South African news channels played the speech on loop with commentators struggling to find words adequate to describe its impact. Kenyan stations broadcast simultaneous translations in Swahili, ensuring that Traoré's message reached every corner of East Africa. Ethiopian television paired the speech with historical footage of Emperor Haile Selassie's 1936 League of Nations address, drawing parallels between two moments of African defiance separated by nearly a century. The continental media ecosystem had found its defining moment, and they refused to let it pass unnoticed. International news desks from New York to Tokyo worked through the night, their editors recognizing that Traoré's response had fundamentally shifted global diplomatic discourse. The Wall Street Journal's front page would feature a full transcript alongside analysis of potential economic implications for Western African relations. The Financial Times dedicated an emergency editorial to what they call the Geneva Awakening, acknowledging that African economic independence was no longer a distant possibility, but an imminent reality. Lean's African correspondents provided historical context, explaining how Traore's words represented the culmination of decades of growing African assertiveness. The Guardian commissioned urgent opinion pieces from African intellectuals, finally providing platforms for voices that had been marginalized in international discourse for too long. By morning every major publication would acknowledge that the world had changed in those 15 minutes, and there would be no going back to the old order of silence and submission. 6 months after Geneva, the ripple effects of Traore's 15-minute response continued to reshape the global political landscape in ways no one had anticipated. African Union meetings that had once been perfunctory affairs now buzzed with the energy of genuine continental cooperation. As leaders found their voices emboldened by Traore's example, the Economic Community of West African States announced its own currency backed by gold reserves directly challenging French monetary hegemony in the region. Universities across Africa reported record enrollment in political science and international relations programs, with students citing Traore's speech as their inspiration to engage in diplomacy. Western embassies throughout the continent found themselves dealing with increasingly confident African negotiators who no longer accepted one-sided agreements. The young president's words had awakened a sleeping giant that refused to be lulled back into submission. Judge Thomas Harrison III had quietly resigned from the International Court of Justice II. Weeks after Geneva, his decades-long career destroyed by 15 seconds of exposed racism. His replacement, ironically, was a Ghanaian legal scholar whose first act was to establish new protocols for respectful diplomatic discourse. European diplomatic schools scrambled to revise their curricula, finally acknowledging that their traditional approaches to African relations were not just outdated, but counterproductive. The Swiss government issued formal apologies for hosting such a breach of diplomatic protocol, promising new measures to ensure equal treatment of all international representatives. Harrison's law firm in Atlanta quietly removed his name from the letterhead, his professional legacy forever tainted by that moment of revealed prejudice. The personal cost of institutional racism had finally been made visible for the world to see. African youth movements exploded across the continent would go back to Africa, transforming from colonial insult to rallying cry for continental pride and unity. Universities from Cairo to Cape Town organized true conferences examining African solutions to African problems without Western interference. Technology hubs in Lagos, Nairobi, and Accra reported unprecedented investment as young entrepreneurs sought to build the self-sufficient Africa their president had envisaged. Cultural festivals celebrating African heritage drew record crowds, with Burkina Faso becoming an unexpected pilgrimage destination for continental patriots. The speech had ignited a cultural renaissance that was reshaping African identity on a generational level. What had begun as one man's dignified response to racism had become a continent's declaration of independence from mental colonialism. 1 year later, as Traore addressed the United Nations General Assembly to thunderous applause from African delegations, the transformation was undeniable and irreversible. His Geneva speech was being taught in schools from Senegal to Somalia as an example of how dignity and truth could triumph over prejudice and power. Western foreign ministries had quietly begun hiring African consultants to help them navigate the new reality of dealing with confident, self-assured African leadership. The Burkina Faso flag flew proudly outside the rebuilt AU headquarters in Addis Ababa, a symbol of the continent awakening to its own potential. Traore's 15-minute response had accomplished what decades of liberation movements had struggled to achieve, forcing the world to see Africa as it truly was. History would remember Geneva not as the day a judge insulted a president, but as the day Africa finally found its voice. Ibrahim Traoré's legendary 15-minute response transformed a moment of humiliation into Africa's declaration of dignity. One speech shattered centuries of diplomatic pretense, proving that truth spoken with courage can change the world. What did you think of this historic moment? Subscribe and share your thoughts below.